She was 27 years old. She had a name that opened every door on the eastern seaboard. She had a face that painters requested to immortalize. She had a mother-in-law who controlled the literal guest lists of American society, who got in, who was exiled, who simply ceased to exist in polite company. She died in 1881. The official story was pneumonia. The actual story was something the Gilded Age was extraordinarily skilled at producing and extraordinarily skilled at burying. A young woman systemically dismantled by expectation, by isolation, by the architecture of a family that treated human beings as portfolio assets. The Astors were not merely wealthy. They were America's first experiment in aristocracy, a family that built its fortune on fur trading, Manhattan real estate speculation, and the labor of tens of thousands of people who would never once be invited to dinner. At the apex of this dynasty stood one woman, Caroline Webster Schermerhorn Astor, known simply as the Mrs. Astor, the self-appointed queen of American society, the woman who invented the concept of the 400, the exact number of people deemed worthy of existing in her ballroom. And Emily? Emily was her daughter-in-law, her acquisition, her subordinate. This is not a story about a villain in the traditional sense. This is something more disturbing than that. This is a story about a system, about how Gilded Age matriarchal power could be just as weaponized, just as annihilating as any patriarchal institution, about how the Emily Astor tragedy exposes the rotting infrastructure beneath the diamond surface of Caroline Astor's America, about complicit mothers, transactional marriages, and the specific, clinical cruelty of a Gilded Age family feud, dressed in Worth gowns and philanthropic galas. Today we deconstruct the gilded cage. We follow the money, the manipulation, and the medicine. And we ask the question the obituaries refuse to ask. Was Emily Astor's death a medical tragedy? Or was it the predictable conclusion of a life that was never permitted to be her own? To understand what happened to Emily Astor, you first need to understand what it meant to become an Astor. Not to be born one, to become one. Because in the Gilded Age power structure that Caroline Astor architected with the precision of a military campaign, marriage was not a romantic institution. It was a merger, a strategic acquisition, a contractual arrangement between families mediated by social visibility, geographic real estate, and the unspoken but brutally enforced rules of a woman who had appointed herself the supreme arbitrator of American respectability. Caroline Schermerhorn was born in 1830 into one of New York's oldest Dutch-descended families. Old money, the kind that sneers at new money the way a cathedral sneers at a strip mall. In 1853, she married William Backhouse Astor Jr., grandson of John Jacob Astor, the fur-trading immigrant who had become, at the time of his death in 1848, the wealthiest man in America. A fortune built, let's be precise about this, on the systematic exploitation of indigenous trade networks in the Great Lakes region, on predatory Manhattan real estate practices that displaced thousands of working-class tenants, and on an opacity of financial record-keeping that would make modern forensic accountants weep. Caroline understood, with the clarity of a chess grandmaster, that her husband's fortune was the foundation, but that she would be the architect. William Backhouse Astor Jr. was, by all historical accounts, a man who preferred his yacht and his mistresses to his wife's social engineering project. He was largely absent, which meant Caroline was not merely the social face of the Astor dynasty, she was its operational center, its CEO, its enforcer. And she built a machine. The machine ran on a deceptively simple principle. Access is power. To be on Caroline Astor's guest list was to exist in American high society. To be removed from it was a form of social death so complete that families relocated to Europe rather than face the humiliation of provincial irrelevance. She didn't use violence. She used invitations, which in the world she constructed was the same thing. Ward McAllister, her chosen social secretary, her willing instrument, formalized this into the notorious concept of the 400, the exact number of people Mrs. Astor deemed worthy of her ballroom, which conveniently happened to be the capacity of said ballroom. This number was not arbitrary. It was a doctrine, a theology of exclusion. Into this machine in 1876 walked Emily Astor. Except walked is the wrong word. Emily didn't walk into this world. She was born into it. She was already an Astor by blood, the daughter of William Waldorf Astor's cousin, and she was married into it further still, in what the society pages breathlessly described as a union of dynasties, when she wed James John Van Alen, a man of sufficient pedigree to satisfy Caroline's specifications. Emily was 22. The society pages described Emily as a young woman of exceptional grace and gentle disposition. Read that phrase again through a historical feminist lens, and it translates with uncomfortable clarity. She was compliant. She was decorative. She was manageable. She had been selected, in part, for these qualities. In the Astor ecosystem, the gentle disposition was not a character trait. It was a prerequisite, an essential qualification for the role she was being hired to perform. Producing heirs, attending the correct events, wearing the correct gowns, laughing at the correct moments, and above all, never, ever challenging the woman at the top of the hierarchy. Before we go further, we need to sit with that split screen, because the diamonds that studded Caroline Astor's famous stomacher jewelry, that extraordinary breastplate of gems she wore to her own galas, did not materialize from the ether. They were financed by Astor rents, by the tenements their real estate empire owned across Lower Manhattan, by families paying an ever-increasing proportion of their meager wages for housing in buildings that the Astors famously, consistently, historically refused to maintain. Jacob Riis, the muckraking journalist who would publish How the Other Half Lives in 1890, documented Astor-owned properties specifically. He described them as among the most dangerous and degraded in the city. Caroline Astor, in that same year, held a ball estimated to have cost $200,000, approximately $6.8 million in today's currency, to celebrate nothing in particular except the fact of her own magnificence. This is the world Emily Astor was inducted into as a functioning ornament. This is the ballroom floor built on rotting timber, and Emily was beginning to feel the rot beneath her feet. By 1879, Emily Astor was unwell. The historical record on this is frustratingly thin, which is itself a historical data point. In the Gilded Age, the illnesses of upper-class women were simultaneously over-documented and strategically vague. Physicians attached to wealthy families were not primarily physicians. They were managers of narrative. Their diagnoses served the family's reputational interests first, and the patient's physical reality a very distant second. The Gilded Age had a medical category designed almost exclusively for women who were inconvenient. Neurasthenia, literally nerve exhaustion. A diagnosis so broad, so infinitely elastic, that it could be applied to any woman who displayed anxiety, sadness, resistance to her social role, intellectual ambition, sexual disinterest in her husband, sexual interest in the wrong people, the audacity to have opinions, or simply the misfortune of existing in a body under extreme psychological strain. Neurasthenia was, in the language of contemporary medical humanities scholarship, a medicalized patriarchy, a system by which the medical establishment converted female distress into female disorder, thereby pathologizing the entirely rational psychological responses to an entirely irrational social imprisonment. We do not know with absolute certainty what Emily Astor suffered from in the final years of her life. The documentation that survives has been filtered through family, through social reputation, through the particular opacity that old money maintains around its casualties. What we can reconstruct from historical context, from the broader pattern of how Gilded Age society women were treated when they became medically inconvenient, and from the specific social dynamics of the Astor family structure, is a picture that is deeply, structurally troubling. Emily had married into a family where the central authority figure, Caroline Astor, her husband's aunt by marriage and the effective matriarch of the entire social dynasty, maintained control through a system of conditional inclusion. You were in favor, or you were not. You met the standard, or you were quietly managed. And the management of inconvenient women in this milieu had very specific tools available to it. Newport, Rhode Island. This is crucial geography. The Astor social calendar was not a casual preference, it was a mandate. The Newport summer season, the New York autumn and winter seasons, the European spring, these were not vacations, they were performances, required, scheduled, managed by Caroline with the ruthlessness of a theatre director who fires actors who miss their cues. For a woman in declining health, this calendar was not merely demanding, it was physiologically dangerous. The travel between properties, the social performances required while ill, the complete absence of any sanctioned space for genuine rest, these were not oversights in the system. They were features of it. Because the alternative, a daughter-in-law who visibly withdrew from society, was a reputational problem for the family. And reputational problems, in Caroline Astor's operational framework, were problems to be solved. Here is where the Gilded Age family feud dynamic that biographers have danced around becomes unmistakable when examined through a feminist historical lens. The relationship between Caroline Astor and her daughters-in-law was not, could not have been, a relationship of equals. Caroline had constructed a social empire whose continued operation required total fealty from those within it. Her daughters-in-law were not family members in any warm, organic sense. They were personnel. They had roles. They had expectations. And deviation from those expectations carried consequences. We know from the historical record, from social correspondence of the period, from the memoirs of figures like Ward McAllister and the later guarded accounts of family associates, that Caroline Astor could exercise her displeasure in ways that were devastatingly effective, precisely because they required no overt aggression. She did not need to do anything dramatic. She simply had to not do things, not invite, not include, not acknowledge. In a world where Caroline's approval was the currency upon which social existence depended, her inaction was a weapon of extraordinary lethality. Emily Astor Van Alen became, in the final years of her short life, effectively invisible. And here we need to be careful and honest about the limits of the historical record, and simultaneously about what those limits themselves tell us. The fact that Emily's deterioration was not thoroughly documented by contemporary sources is not evidence that it didn't happen in the way we are reconstructing it. It is evidence of how Gilded Age families processed their casualties. Quietly, efficiently, with minimal paper trail. Upper-class women who declined, physically, mentally, or socially, were managed in ways that kept them out of newspapers and out of public sympathy. This is the elite cover-up operating not as a conspiracy, but as a cultural reflex. A shared, unspoken understanding among physicians, family, social arbiters, and institutions that certain kinds of suffering were not to be narrativized. By 1880, Emily was 26. She had been married for 4 years. She had fulfilled the primary expectation of her social role. She had produced children. 3 in rapid succession. The physical toll of repeated pregnancy on a young woman's body in the pre-antibiotic, pre-modern obstetric era was not an abstraction. It was documented, clinical, devastating. Physicians of the period understood that rapid successive pregnancies depleted what they called vital force, and we would today describe as nutritional reserves, immune function, cardiovascular health. The expectation that upper-class women produce heirs as rapidly as possible was not complicated by considerations of maternal health. It was framed in the social discourse as a privilege, as the natural fulfillment of feminine purpose. The women who were exhausted by it, who were physically wrecked by it, were encouraged to understand their suffering as personal weakness rather than systemic demand. In 1881, Emily Astor Van Alen died. She was 27 years old. The cause listed was pneumonia, a diagnosis that, in this era, frequently served as a terminal notation for bodies that had simply been worn beyond recovery. Pneumonia was not, in many of these cases, the originating catastrophe. It was the final, opportunistic insult to an immune system already comprehensively defeated. 27 years old. In the same year, her mother-in-law, Caroline Astor, hosted what was described by the New York Times as the most magnificent ball of the decade. The diamonds were, reportedly, exceptional. Let's step back from Emily's specific life for a moment, because while her story is devastating in its particularity, its real historical and analytical power lies in what it reveals about the infrastructure of Gilded Age female experience. Emily Astor's tragedy is not an anomaly. It is a data point in a pattern so consistent, so structurally reproducible, that it demands to be recognized as systemic rather than incidental. The Victorian upper class had developed, by the 1870s and 1880s, a remarkably coherent and mutually reinforcing set of instruments for managing women who, for any reason, became problematic. First, the medical system. As we have discussed, diagnoses like neurasthenia, hysteria, and nervous exhaustion could be applied to essentially any woman displaying any behavior that inconvenienced her family. The treatment for these conditions frequently involved removal from public life, enforced rest, which in practice meant enforced isolation, and the administration of substances ranging from laudanum to various bromide compounds. These were not treatments, they were management protocols. They quieted, they removed, they made the problem less visible. Second, the legal architecture. The Married Women's Property Act had been passed in New York in 1848, a genuine legislative achievement. But its practical application in upper-class families was systematically undermined by the reality that women's social property, their reputation, their access, their mobility, their children's futures, remained entirely within the control of their husband's family. You could theoretically own property. You could not own your position in society. That was always, structurally, on loan from the matriarch. Third, and this is perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated instrument in the arsenal, the matriarchal complicity structure. This is where Caroline Astor becomes, historically, genuinely complex rather than simply villainous. Caroline Astor was not, herself, a free woman. She existed within a patriarchal system that had granted her extraordinary power within a specific domain, the social, while entirely excluding her from the legal, financial, and political domains where actual structural power resided. Her husband William ignored her. The law treated her as a dependent. The business empire she lived off was not hers to control. What she could control was the social architecture she had built, and she defended that control with the intensity of someone who understood, perhaps not consciously, but viscerally, that it was the only domain she possessed. This is the specific horror of the complicit matriarch, a figure that feminist historians, including Leonore Davidoff, in her foundational work on the Victorian upper class, have identified as structurally essential to the perpetuation of patriarchal systems. The complicit matriarch is not the architect of the oppressive system. She is its most effective enforcement mechanism, because she has internalized its values so completely that she enforces them on other women with a ferocity that male authorities rarely need to deploy directly. She does not need to understand she is doing this. She may genuinely believe she is maintaining standards, protecting the family, preserving civilization. The sincerity of the belief does not alter the lethality of the outcome. Emily Astor was not destroyed by Caroline Astor acting alone as some cartoonish villain. She was destroyed by a system in which Caroline Astor was both an enforcer and herself a captive. The tragedy compounds. The complicity spreads. There are no clean hands in this architecture. Now, here is where this history reaches across 140 years and grabs our present moment by the throat. We are living, by overwhelming consensus among economic historians, in a second Gilded Age. The numbers are not subtle. In 2024, the combined wealth of America's billionaire class exceeded $5 trillion, more than the GDP of Japan. The top 1% of Americans now own more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. The mechanisms have changed. Algorithms instead of tenements, platform economics instead of railroad monopolies. But the structural logic is identical. The accumulation of vast private wealth, defended by political influence and legal architecture at the direct expense of the laboring majority. And within this second Gilded Age, we are watching the re-emergence of social phenomena that a historian of Caroline Astor's world would recognize instantly. The tradwife aesthetic, the social media performance of extreme domestic femininity, of women who present their subordination to wealthy husbands as personal liberation, is, viewed through the lens of Gilded Age feminist history, not a new phenomenon. It is a new medium for a very old social performance. The women who performed perfect domesticity in Newport in 1880 were not doing so freely. They were doing so because the alternative, the Caroline Astor alternative, was social annihilation. When we watch young women in 2024 performing elaborate morning routines in aesthetically curated kitchens for the approval of a digital audience, and when we notice how frequently the most successful of these performances is subsidized by a wealthy husband whose financial dominance is carefully aestheticized into something called being provided for, we are watching the Emily Astor dynamic in its contemporary digital form. The Gilded Cage has Wi-Fi now. The performance has metrics. The reproductive rights dimension of Emily's story also resonates with a terrible clarity in our current moment. Emily Astor produced 3 children in 4 years. She had no meaningful legal recourse to decline this, not in the social context in which she lived, where her primary value to the family was reproductive, where her husband's family controlled her social existence, and where the medical system was not her advocate, but the family's instrument. She was expected to produce heirs at a rate her body could not sustain, and when her body failed, the system registered this primarily as a social inconvenience rather than a human tragedy. In 2022, the United States Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, removing federal reproductive rights protections and returning abortion regulation to individual states. The medical and political debate that followed was, in striking historical parallels, heavily shaped by wealthy, powerful actors using institutional and legal mechanisms to control women's reproductive choices. The language has changed. The mechanism, institutional control of female bodies in the service of social or political agendas, is identical in structure to what Emily Astor experienced in 1877. And finally, the wellness industry as contemporary medicalized management. The Victorian prescription for nervous upper-class women, removal from stimulation, enforced rest, chemical quieting, has a direct contemporary descendant in the $4.5 trillion global wellness industry, a significant proportion of which targets affluent women experiencing the psychological distress of lives that are materially comfortable and structurally suffocating simultaneously. The Gilded Age gave a distressed woman laudanum and told her to rest. The second Gilded Age gives her a cortisol-balancing supplement subscription, a $40 adaptogen latte, and a meditation app, and tells her that her distress is a personal optimization problem rather than a structural one. The individual is pathologized. The system is never questioned. Emily Astor, lying in her darkened room in 1880, was told her suffering was a matter of nervous constitution. Her physicians managed her. Her family managed the narrative. The system that had produced her suffering continued, unexamined, to its next acquisition. We have not, as a civilization, fully escaped this logic. We have updated its aesthetic. Emily Astor Van Alen lived for 27 years. Her name survives primarily as a footnote to the names of more powerful people. A daughter-in-law in the family chronology, a figure in the peripheral vision of histories that center Caroline Astor's empire building, or William Waldorf Astor's architectural ambitions, or the society drama of who controlled the Astor name. She is, in the historical record, a supporting character in someone else's narrative. That is not a coincidence. That is the system, still functioning. That is the architecture of erasure, working exactly as designed, long after the architects are dead, long after the ballrooms have become hotels, long after the diamonds have been reset in different settings for different women who may or may not know whose finger wore them first. Here is what I want to leave you with. Not a conclusion, because this story doesn't have one, but a provocation. We have a cultural tendency to process histories like Emily's as stories of individual cruelty, as cautionary tales about monstrous individuals, about specific bad actors who could, in theory, be removed from the equation and thereby solve the problem. We want a villain. We want Caroline Astor to be simply evil so that the story has an ending, and the ending is the evil person is gone and the evil is resolved. But the Emily Astor tragedy is a story about something more disturbing than individual evil. It is a story about how systems reproduce themselves through people. How a woman like Caroline, herself constrained and diminished by the patriarchal structure she lived within, can become the most efficient enforcer of that structure's violence against other women, without ever consciously intending harm. Caroline Astor outlived Emily by nearly 3 decades. She died in 1908 at 77, in the mansion that had been the stage for her life's defining performance. In her final years, she suffered from dementia and was reportedly found wandering her ballrooms at night, receiving imaginary guests, greeting ghosts. A woman who had built her empire on the control of appearances spent her final chapter unable to distinguish appearance from reality. I'll leave you to decide what to make of that. What I will say is this: the next time you encounter a system, a workplace, a family structure, a social hierarchy, an institution that asks a human being to sacrifice their physical and psychological health to the maintenance of that system's image, and calls that sacrifice duty, or grace, or standards, ask who benefits from the sacrifice. Ask who is managing the narrative, and ask whose name won't appear in the history books. The question I want to leave in the comments is this one, and I want you to sit with it before you answer, because it's harder than it looks. Was Emily Astor a victim of Caroline Astor specifically? Or was Caroline Astor herself a victim of the same system, simply positioned higher within it? And if both things are true simultaneously, what does that tell us about how we assign blame and how we dismantle systems versus how we simply identify villains and move on? If this kind of deep dive historical feminist analysis is something you want more of, the stories that the Gilded Surfaces were specifically designed to cover, subscribe. There's an entire architecture of stories like Emily's, women who existed at the intersections of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary constraint, women whose names appear only in the footnotes. We're going to put their names in the title. Next time, we go to the asylums. Because the Gilded Age didn't only silence inconvenient women socially. Sometimes it locked the door. Subscribe, leave your thoughts, and remember, the gilded cage is still a cage. See you next time.